and for chairing the session. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today and to be able to present you the results of the SoFAIR project. And today we have the following agenda. We want to walk you through some of the overall project mission and the outputs that we have created. The project has started in January 2024, and so we want to show you and basically give you an idea about what has been developed over the last 2 years. We then so I will do that. It will take probably about 10-15 minutes. Then I will hand over to David, who will give you a demonstration of the key capabilities of the outputs that the SoFAIR project has produced. We will then move on to the panel. We have 3 amazing panelists. We will introduce them later, but you can read their names already on the slide, and then we will just conclude. We have allocated 75 minutes for the webinar, but we might be done, and we will aim to finish within 60 minutes. So with that, let me just tell you a little bit about the composition of the project, just to give appreciation to all of the project partners. So I've been very privileged to be allowed to be the coordinator of the project. I am a professor of data science, as David said, at the Open University. Also, we have a couple of other people from the Open University, like David and Matteo here. But the project overall has 6 partners, basically. These partners involve a Polish partner, IBL PAN. We have a partner from INRIA from France, but the French partner is represented by 3 infrastructures, specifically Software Heritage, HAL, and also people from SoftSide. We also have Brno University of Technology in the Czech Republic. We have also Europe PubMed Central among the project partners. So 6 partners, 4 countries, and a 2-year project, basically. So this is the sort of framework of the core project. Okay, let me quickly introduce you to the problem that the SoFAIR project, which is and that's an abbreviation for Making Software Fair, what the project has been trying to solve as a problem, or contribute to solving a problem. In 2016, there was a study by a researcher called Baker, who surveyed many other researchers, 1,500 scientists, in fact, to understand how they see and effectively asking to what extent they feel that there is a reproducibility crisis. And more than 70% of researchers in that survey answered that they have tried in the past and that they failed to reproduce another scientist's experiments. And what is even more extraordinary is that 50% of them admitted that they failed to reproduce even their own experiments. So this kind of suggests and makes you think about what are the reasons why people very often fail to reproduce other scientists' work. Among one of the key reasons, if you go deeper into it, is actually that research software is very rarely even available. And so effectively, if research software is not available, if I cannot basically get and read a particular research study, and I cannot then go and download the source code, then this is putting me already, as someone who tries to reproduce a particular research study, into a very difficult position. So what we understand as the project is that, of course, by making research software registered and available, we're not going to be able to necessarily completely resolve the reproducibility crisis. But what we strongly believe is that unless research source code and research software is made available, is made more prominent, we will not be able to solve the reproducibility crisis. And so the key kind of way of and contribution of the SoFAIR project is that we believe that a key issue that is hindering sort of the discoverability, attribution, and reusability of open research software is that actually the existence of this open research software often remains in a way hidden within the manuscript of research papers. And I will very quickly show you what I mean by that. Specifically, imagine that this is a particular research paper that you might be reading, and that paper might mention somewhere in the body of the manuscript that there was some particular research software that was used to capture an optical image of the prepared slide on a flatbed scanner prior to analysis, for instance. And what we would really like to have is we would like to have the understanding that this software, in this case called Advion, called ChipSoftX, which was created by someone who was called Advion, which might be the name of the let's say an organization or provider. It could be name of a research group. We would like to have that information, and it would be very important to record that information. So coming a little bit back to this, we believe that research software needs to be treated as what we call a first-class bibliographic citizen, first-class bibliographic record. We are, as researchers, very often putting a lot of sweat and a lot of effort into making sure that our manuscripts are absolutely polished, that they, communicate the research studies in an incredibly good way, because we understand that these research manuscripts will need to undergo a peer review process. And the peer review process is, let's be quite honest, sometimes quite brutal. Not many papers tend to get accepted, and therefore we spend a lot of time on crafting and curating our manuscripts so that they are as perfect as possible. We spend considerably less time on making sure that our research software is known, that it's linked, and that it's made available and archived for future generations. A very similar thing, in fact, also applies to research data, but this is another problem and probably scope for another project. As part of the research, as part of the SoFAIR project, we have tested a lot of different tools for and conducted research on automatic extraction of research software mentions from scientific documents. We started with a tool called SoftCite originally, and we used the models from SoftCite, but our analysis and experimentation went significantly beyond SoftCite. And we have tested many different models. And in fact, if you're interested in learning more about this, we have next week, we are presenting, specifically David is presenting a paper on identifying and classifying software mentions in full-text scholarly documents at JCDL 2025. So if you're interested, there is a manuscript which goes which is a product of this research project. Overall, what we have found is that software mention extraction is very much domain dependent. We discovered that there are differences. We are potentially able to extract software mentions with high accuracy, but when models have high accuracy, they also tend to be more resource demanding, and which kind of means that that it's very difficult for us to scale the operation of software mention extraction across millions of documents, which we have, for instance, in core. And so when you kind of ask yourself what kind of model has been produced by SoFAIR as a project, our answer would be a little bit more complicated. We would need to say and admit that there are certain models which are very good for certain types of situations. There are some models which are more preferable to some use cases, and we're going to show you some of those use cases. So if you think about use cases that require scalability, we would recommend slightly different models from situations where, for instance, you need high accuracy, but you're happy to tolerate, it's acceptable to tolerate a slower, you need more performance, but it's acceptable to tolerate slower running time, basically. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to tell you a little bit about the SoFAIR overall workflow. The SoFAIR project has been sort of centered around a particular workflow which we wanted to through which or using which we wanted to demonstrate the possibility of how we can advance the area of managing research software. I want to be very open with you and blunt in a sense that this is not necessarily the only workflow through which the assets created by the software project can be used. It is one of the workflows on which we wanted to demonstrate it, and we will then later mention 3 other workflows through which things work. But it is definitely a very important workflow because it contains something which we call a validation step with the author itself. And I'll explain that in just 1 minute. So what the SoFAIR workflow shows you is the tools and how specific tools and infrastructures can work together in combination to address this particular problem. So you can see that in step 1, we have an author who deposits a particular manuscript that contains either explicit or implicit mentions of that software. In step 2, the research paper is then harvested from the repository by core and software mentions extracted from the full text research paper using machine learning tools. In step 3, we, via the core repository dashboard, so this is a tool which any repository manager can access basically. So via the core repository dashboard, a request to validate the extracted mentions is made available to that repository. And with the authorization of the repository manager, this is then routed to the author by means of an email notification. And the author can then validate this request. I will then later say how this orchestration is carried out and enabled. Once validated, the repository issues an asset registration request to Software Heritage. And Software Heritage, which is an archive of research software, and our Software Heritage responds by making or minting a permanent identifier for that research software, and that's basically where the workflow finishes. This workflow is only possible, or has only been made possible, via a protocol which we heavily used called Core Notify, standing for the Confederation of Open Access Repositories Notify Protocol. This protocol is used basically for the interaction between the core infrastructure and the repository infrastructure, and also for the interaction between the repository infrastructure and the Software Heritage Archive. So it's an enabling technology for the orchestration. What you can see in the SoFAIR solution, so once we have managed to go through the workflow, so once the workflow, for instance, like once a particular paper has been deposited and went through the entire workflow, we would have arrived at the following position. We have an article metadata record, including the software mention relationship. So we have a relationship between a research paper and the research software, explicit relationship, with a SWID, which is effectively a permanent identifier for the research software. We have suddenly better visibility of that open research software for open access repositories, because that software is then registered within a research repository. And we have achieved long-term archival for that research software. And finally, because we have now registered this research software as an asset in an institutional or another repository, it is possible now to cite and recognize the people who created that research software. So it has now become a bibliographic record. Okay. This is my last slide. I would like to mention here that that the project has produced a range of assets. We have produced 4 research papers addressing different stages of the workflow and different components. We have created a workflow documentation. This is a documentation for anybody who would want to develop and basically become creative with the research workflow. We have provided also something which we call a solution documentation. This is effectively this is a place from which you can see the individual components, the software components that are implementing the SoFAIR workflow. So everything is open source, so you can build on those and extend those solutions. Because the objective, of course, of the SoFAIR project was to create prototypes and we wanted this the solution to be as modular as possible, so that components of the solution could be reused and tweaked even in different constellations. And with that, I am very pleased to actually hand over to David, who will now give us a demonstration of the workflow and how this comes to life, basically, on an example of one particular paper. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Peter. Hopefully you can all see and hear me fine. I'm just going to share my screen, so I'll just take Peter away from you. What I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to take you through the stages that Peter just showed you on the diagram. It's, with no offense to Peter, it's fairly dry and fairly academic. So actually seeing each of those stages as we go through them. Can you see my screen? Yep, okay, I'm getting a thumbs up from Peter. That's perfect, right? I'm going to actually minimize that bit so I can see it and talk about it in. Now, this is an interesting paper. The reason I picked this paper is it contains a lot of software mentioned, so there's a lot to work with here. And you can see it's talking about Faust, which is an application program for web audio that was actually developed by the people in this paper. So actually, stage one is the author has deposited the paper in HAL, and obviously once the paper has been deposited, Core will then aggregate that paper and it's made available actually in Core. So if we just open the paper here in the Core reader, we'll be able to see here let's just open that, and of course that will go on a go slow because I'm now actually using my network for other things. And what I'll do is if I use this version of paper here, you can see actually we're talking about the main piece of software that's under discussion here is actually called Faust, and it's Faust DSL. And if we scroll to the end of the paper, we can see in the acknowledgement section just here, he says quite clearly the source code for the Faust and the IDE projects developed by this paper are available here at these GitHub repositories. And this is a GitHub repository that's actually called GRAM. And if we look here, this is the GRAM, which is the National Center for Music Creation in France. So this is actually registered in a code repository that is attached to this project. But if we go back to the paper, and we look at some of the other examples here, there's a nice one here. It talks about, for example, to this end, some initiatives have been proposed, and here they say a proposal for a web audio plugin standard. They call it standard. They don't actually call it software, but we can then see that there's an API, there's an SDK, there's the online plugin tool. So there's clearly an awful lot of software behind this, and one of them that's running a lot of the audio stuff here is this one here that's called Web Audio Plugins. And it's hosted on this GitHub repo. And to be honest, I did initially think that Mic Buffer was actually the name of the application. I then realized if we look at it, it's actually the Michel Buffer is one of the authors of the paper. So here you've got a fairly considerable piece of work with a funding behind it, but a proportion of the code at least is actually being hosted on the author's own personal GitHub repository. And outside of the text of this paper, there's no link between the research and the software that was being used. So what the SoFAIR models are doing when the paper arrives in Core is this paper is then read, it's then scanned for these software mentions, and then within the tool which is the Core dashboard, which can show you many things about your repository. Peter mentioned this in terms of it being used by core data providers and core members to provide a range of services. And in this case, we're looking at the research software mentions. And we can see here's all the mentions here. So if I just do this quickly, if I search for this particular paper, I spelt it right. Yeah. We see it's here. So here's this paper. And you can actually see here are the mentions, the software mentions that have been actually extracted from this paper. In this case, we've got the Kapnitov plugins pack, which is actually something, and I said the models can actually tell the difference between whether something is just mentioned in the paper, which is okay, it's interesting, or what we're really interested in is whether something is created in the paper. If we look at this, we can see the software here was Faust, and here's the GitHub link, and it notes that it's created. And the second one we looked at was the web audio plugins, and here's the context and the fact that it was created. and the link. Now, what the repository manager can do at this point, having checked through this, is if your repository is core notify enabled, you can simply tick on the button there, and the notification with all of the metadata and all of the approval has now been sent to the repository inbox. This is still available if your repository is not yet core notify enabled, and we can actually send you a link to a validation form. We can generate a validation form. That bar's come up in a really annoying place now, which contains the same information here. Here's the paper name and all the things, and within this the authors can actually say no and just remove it completely. They can edit either the name of the software if there's an error in it, and they can also edit the repository link, and they can change the type of mention that it was in this case. And also the model produces, you'll see, a confidence score, and the author can go through, tick all of these, and then click on save, and that will send the notification back to the repository that has then been validated. And if we go back to this paper here, when that notification comes back to the repository, I'm going to show you an image here. Unfortunately, I'm sorry about the terrible quality. This is actually an internal image from HAL, and we can see the paper here is displayed. It's the using Faust DSL, and now down as part of the metadata contained within the paper is the research software mentions part of it. So apologies, that's a fairly poor screenshot, but that's actually an internal INRIA screenshot, so I don't have access to that platform. Now, the next stage that Petter mentioned is once the software has been validated, is this making sure the software remains permanent. And this is where the core notify protocol comes in again, and this is where it sends the payload. And you can see this is the payload for this particular example, which is being sent by core regarding the web audio plugins, and this is being sent to Software Heritage. Software Heritage will then return this, which will tie the ID for the GitHub link for the web to the DOI and the metadata for the paper. And then the final stage is that piece of software is then archived within Software Heritage itself, and it's issued with what's called a SWID, which is a Software Heritage ID, which is a permanent archive ID for that piece of software. And the circle is then complete from the paper that issued it now being permanently linked to the software that was created with it, and to a permanently archived piece of software that has its own permanent identifier. On that, I will stop sharing my screen. I hope that was informative, and if I now hand back to Petter, I can unmute Petter.
Thank you very much, David. I think that's absolutely great. What's I think what we tried to do with this demonstration was to show you all the individual stages. What in reality there might be some time lag basically between the individual stages. That's why we kind of couldn't invoke all those stages, one from another, because effectively core would discover certain things. There's a process for that. Core would detect, basically core would make something available to a repository manager. The repository manager would then approve. Or potentially in the future, you can imagine that some of those repository managers might say that they are comfortable for these things to be automatically approved, for instance, if they have a particular confidence of extraction. And then some stuff gets sent to the author, and the author, so there's a little bit of a time lag there, of course, but the importance, we believe that the validation step is very important because, of course, the authors we want to know if the authors take responsibility for that software. The fact that some software is mentioned in a particular research paper doesn't necessarily mean that that software has been created by the paper. And of course, the extraction is able to detect the intent basically of this, but it doesn't mean that the intent, it still means that we would like to, in an ideal world, we would like to capture all of mentions of software. But if the mention is about new software that the academic has created, then that means that a new entity really needs to be created and assigned to the author of that research software, because then that provides credit basically for the author. So I hope this is clear. I just want to mention that, you know, we showed you what we call the main research or main SoFAIR workflow, but there are other use cases that we have worked on as part of the project. One of the notable use cases is a use case conducted with Europe PubMed Central. The idea of the use case was that there's full-text machine readable open. There are full-text machine readable open access research papers in Europe PubMed Central. So full machine readable means that I can query Europe PubMed Central using by means of, let's say, showing by means of a particular program, and that what you can see here is a particular, Europe PubMed Central is going to respond to me in JSON. And basically what they will show is this thing that, this example shows some piece of software which is called ggcaller as a software mention in Europe PMC. So what we have effectively created is that the output of Europe PubMed Central now contains an annotation for which has a provider called SoFAIR basically, and you can see that it has a type of software mention, and basically it describes this software ggcaller, and it gives a URI to GitHub for where on GitHub this research software is created. And this means that we now have a very explicit link between the research paper and the research software. Okay. Another example is what we call a SoFAIR short loop. This is an example scenario where basically the repository, at the time of deposit, already conducts extraction of the software, basically, or the software mentions, and immediately feedbacks to the author that is trying to deposit the paper. So effectively, the idea of this is that I'm an author, I'm coming to a particular repository system, I'm uploading the paper, and the system is now confronting me with the following information. It says, I believe that you have identified you are introducing some new research software. Would you like to register it, for instance? So that's the idea of what we call the short loop. The disadvantage of this workflow is that it basically, it means that the repository software would need to be able to run the software extraction, and that might not always be desirable. So, but in some situations, for instance, in the case of HAL, this is a bigger repository system, so they probably can do it. But not every repository system would probably be scaled to conduct that workflow, and that's why both of these workflows, the main SoFAIR workflow as well as this one, have value. The last use case I want to mention to you is something that makes me particularly excited. This is a use case directly between core and software heritage as an archive. It is a particular use case which basically says and asks the question of, can we extract with very high confidence, basically, some mentions of research software without a validation step. So it understands basically that in some circumstances it is not possible to necessarily conduct the author. But can we at least extract a subset of research software where the confidence of the automated system is high, so that we can increase the coverage basically of links between research papers and research software. And so what we have conducted in this workflow is that we completely bypass the repository validation step, and core sends, using the core notify protocol, to software heritage like a stream of notifications whenever new software is being discovered. This is a particular use case which we are trying to put into, which we see that this is something that goes beyond the lifetime of the project, and we are going to make it available as a service. If there was, core is going to produce this stream basically of software mentions, of extracted software mentions, and it this stream could be used by other systems, not necessarily only software heritage, which would be able to listen to this stream basically and register and do whatever actions they feel would be useful. And with that, that's kind of everything I wanted to communicate. Hopefully, this was to some extent understandable. If you feel that you would like to get some, you have some questions, then feel free to put them into the chat. But with all of this, I would really like to open the discussion. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to chair the discussion basically, but I'm going to ask Arfon, Kathleen, and John, who have been very, very kind to come here to show their cameras, show themselves basically, reveal themselves, and introduce introduce themselves very briefly. So I'm going to start with Arfon.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear.
Fantastic. Thanks for inviting me to this session today. It's great to see this work maturing. My name's Arvon Smith. I am a senior fellow at Schmidt Sciences. We fund a fair amount of research software, and we're very invested in seeing that work tracked and credit received for the people who do that work, and very much aligned with where you were framing this work in terms of reproducibility and describing completely the scholarly record. So yeah, very happy to be on the call today.
Thank you so much, Arfon, for being here. Kathleen?
Yeah, thanks also for inviting me. I'm the executive director of the other core, which is Confederation of Open Access Repositories. And well, I guess my main, relationship with this project is that they're using the core notify protocol, which is great. And that is the whole purpose of the protocol. So we started developing the notify protocol about 3 years ago, and it's in a very stable release now. And the idea behind that is really to be able to link related resources across the repository ecosystem and with other types of services. So basically to link related resources. So it's great to be here, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, that's fantastic. And the last one is John.
Hello, so I'm John Salter. Not quite the repository manager, but I'm the White Rose Library's technical officer. So I do the sort of development, and we have a community of people who kind of manage our repository together, which is a shared service between the University of Leeds, University of Sheffield, the University of York, based on ePrint's platform. So I've got the kind of technical layer knowledge, and I can see some fun development coming my way possibly, and also some interesting other sort of factors within our setup that might help or hinder us. But I guess we'll come on to that in a minute.
Okay, so I'm very pleased that we have a panel of high esteemed experts who each of them coming from a slightly different perspective. So I have a kickoff question basically for you, and which is, how important is it that scholarly infrastructure tracks research software in the same way as papers are currently being tracked? And so I wonder which of you wants to start basically, and what your opinions might be. Or let me do it this way. Let's start from John.
So I think, I mean, at Leeds, we've got a community of research software engineers who create hopefully very useful things, and they'll have a lifetime beyond their initial sort of research projects. And so actually getting those people engaged in creating new and novel things, and then allowing the community around them and further afield to actually get more out of the investment in those things. I think that's what I think would interest me most, and then you then everyone's standing on shoulders of bigger giants beneath them, and eventually those researchers become their own giants, and the world goes around better. I think.
John, can I ask just a clarification question? So a lot of institutions are now building also, in addition to their manuscript repositories, they are also providing data repositories, right? Do you see at some point in the future institutions providing solutions for capturing research software? And if so, how do you imagine this playing out?
So I think that the nature of the use of research software is slightly different to your manuscript sort of thing. And so having things like I think the software heritage site that may have already captured, and things like Zenodo that have already captured a release of software. So I don't think keeping the artifacts, as long as those are in trusted systems, keeping the artifacts locally is necessarily the right thing. But keeping a reference to both the software that you have as an institution created, but also possibly the software that you as an institution have used in your research is useful. So yeah, there's all different sort of point releases that software lifecycle goes through, and so being able to store all of those for any given project is quite an undertaking. And specialist archives out there already may be the best capture of those.
Absolutely. So metadata is key, basically, right? Thanks very much, John. Kathleen?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with John. Like the complexity of collecting research software is beyond probably most institutional repositories' capacity or capabilities. So, software heritage and some of these larger repositories are very important in the ecosystem. But as to your other question, I think, you started, Peter, the presentation by saying, the problem that you're trying to solve is reproducibility, or one of the problems. So I think the importance of these, these artifacts it really depend on what we're trying to achieve by preserving them. Are we trying to preserve them so that we can ensure scientific claims are reproducible, or are we trying to do it, because I think you kind of slightly referred to this as well, or maybe it was Arfon who said this, like, is this about recognition and getting recognition for work that you do beyond just writing a research paper, but producing some kind of research software? So I guess it's a complicated question. There's limited capacity in some ways to be able to collect everything, so we need to make important choices about what we want to curate and preserve over time, and what the reasons are behind that. So that probably isn't a great answer to your question, but
it's a great
some of the
answer.
things. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And Arfon?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered a lot of, some of the motivations for me in the start of your presentation today. But I think research software is absolutely critical for modern research, and fundamentally, it's sometimes mentioned, and you've shown approaches for detecting those mentions. Some very rarely truly cited, and I've thought a lot about that in my time. And I know there's been some progress on that over the years, but it's still very, very rare. And so it's mostly invisible in the scholarly record. And so, as far as I'm concerned, and you can apply this to, protocols and data and software, the record of what we do and the work we share with each other is incomplete today. It's almost completely anchored around papers, and so if we want to understand what's been done, and that could be for lots of reasons, including reproducibility and credit and recognition. But if we just want a complete scholarly record, which I think we should strive for, then we need software to show up in that. And so, and there's just a bunch of reasons to do that. And so I think a lot of the work I do in this space, I come to it from a sort of we have a problem incentivizing good software, and so I often see all of this work through the lens of credit and tracking, and people being able to sort of report their impact. But in truth, there are many motivations, and they all can lead you to the same conclusion that we need a more complete scholarly record.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I just add something
Kathleen,
to what Arfon was saying? Because I'm working with a younger scholar. He's he's developing software, but he can't get promoted because the software, what you were saying, Arfon, is basically it's invisible to his peers in terms of a scholarly product and contributing to the scholarly record. So I've witnessed that, and I'm sure several other people have as well, that and if it's not recognized, then it can't be in your CV and contribute to all of these various processes where you are able to get promotion and tenure.
Yeah. This is, by the way, a fantastic segue to my next question. So let's start with Arfon, actually. And this is basically the part of the SoFAIR process is actually validation of the mentions. It's one of the optional parts of the process. And, we, of course, if you want to be credited for something, it would be kind of awkward to create some sort of a record for you without you knowing that it actually exists. So how can we best demonstrate the benefits of software citation to the authors and sort of encourage them to take these opportunities up in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I definitely understand some of the reservations here. I think I would definitely, I think of this as a little bit of a sort of a product adoption problem, which is how do you sort of demonstrate the value of what you're trying to do when people aren't already doing it. So this is sort of, how do you sort of lead people to something that we think would be a good for them and good for us, good for the community. And so often, I think you've done a lot of work to sort of build the operational system. You've got you built the sort of constituent parts here. And now I would be finding small groups of people, maybe where software maybe historically is well recognized or poorly recognized. Like find a smaller cohort of users where you can really sit down with them and really sort of understand how well the workflow works for them and just really get that feedback from users, a smaller group, a targeted group where they're more like each other. And maybe you already have some of those relationships. But I definitely I think it's really hard to sort of broadcast something into the world and try and collect feedback. I think it's often much easier if you pick a targeted group. And then, and that's just a reasonable tactic for anyone trying to build something. The other thing I would say, and this is more about sort of advertising and adoption, the other thing I've done in the past when trying to gain traction around things is find people who are seen as leaders in their field, maybe people who, despite all of the headwinds against them, have succeeded in academia, but also care deeply about software, and find those community sort of advocates and ambassadors who will sort of say, this is cool, I'm doing this for my stuff, and maybe, can sort of really, I don't like the thought leader term, but people who are respected as leaders in their field, and have them sort of signal and show that they support the work. So again, it's a little bit of sort of, the second one's a bit more advertising, but the first one is much more about really solidifying the workflow based on real conversations with real users. And I would pick a targeted group to try and have those conversations.
Thank you, Arfon, and that's a great suggestion. John, do you have any opinion about any answer to that question?
Yeah, as you were making your presentation, I was thinking sort of similar to Arfon. Like if we, as the repository, got that kind of sort of notification of say the University of Leeds sort of profile of what's been detected in our set of papers already, and we could go and do an internal presentation to the research software engineers and interested developers that are making the software and say, look, this is what we already know is out there, sort of thing, and this is where your stuff is going that you don't even know about yet. And this is, I think, those little kind of, you get little twinkles in people's eyes when they're like, actually, and that's the hook that you want. And then as well as the this is doing software better, this is doing the things in the right way to make your things more citable, and making those pieces of software actually units of output in their own right. In the UK, definitely there's a focus on the referable outputs, which obviously this isn't currently, but and that kind of also goes through to the resources available for validating and checking records. And that was sort of one of the issues things I thought is currently our repository system at Leeds and Sheffield and York are connected to CHIST systems, and so be able to sort of pipe some of these notifications through the repository into the CHIST ecosystem is a slightly different thing to try and comprehend. And so working out how that loop works is going to be interesting, but getting the humans involved and engaged, and hopefully at some point getting them to make their software citations in their own records, in a way that we don't then have to reparse everything every time. It's just a link to a persistent identifier to a piece of software. That'd be lovely eventually.
Actually, that's really interesting, John. And I realized that maybe then, based on what you're saying, the bar might be even lower than I expected. Basically, you're saying that already, like giving an institution a list of research software that has been extracted from their publications might already be something valuable with which some research managers could work basically within their institutions. And that's actually really cool because that's not something I realized that people would be willing to potentially confront their academics and work with them. So that's really cool. Kathleen, do you have any opinion about that question? Any answer?
Yeah, I mean, I just to agree with both Arfan and John, like I think you could leverage the individual repository managers that you have in your community because they have direct access to the researchers through their institution. And then, the other aspect is, of course, we need to work on changing the research assessment system, which we say over and over. And so I think, the refable thing is a really important one. And I guess I haven't really followed what COARA, the COARA group is doing in terms of how they're dealing with software recognition for software contributions. But I think certainly, as a broader community, we need to make sure that these discussions are happening with those types of groups as well.
That's really interesting, of course. And maybe just to mention, as John mentioned, the REF process, then indeed, as part of the REF process, even things which are, even research outputs, which are, let's say, research software, are technically they are refable. In practice, I don't know whether anyone ever submitted research software as part of their refable output, but it is possible in principle to do so. I have a question directly for Arfon now, which is SoFAIR is a prototype, okay? And how do we best, in your opinion, work with the community and with funders to kind of enable us to move from prototype to production, basically? To some extent, you have already answered part of that question, so I don't want to repeat myself. But what do you have an opinion? Do you have advice for us, basically, on how we can do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of some of it is adoption and just get awareness, and I think we sort of covered that already. I think there are also so that there's a sort of making detection and reporting and tracking and making software fair is something that I think a lot of funders, for example, have already said, this is a policy we have. And so making it obvious to them, and this might be advocacy there's potentially lots of ways you can engage there, but presenting SoFAIR as a sort of the default relatively low friction way of complying with the expectations that funders have already placed on their fundees, on their grantees, I think is a good tactic. I think there's presumably other projects and communities you would want to integrate with. So maybe there are, if there's sort of a SoFAIR workflow that gains recognition as a recognized thing, then broadening the sort of coverage, broadening the repositories you're working with, and there's lots of potential teams that would be integrators for you in the future. So thinking about this as just the first sort of phase of the work, and then I think and then the sort of that lends us then about harder, longer term questions about sort of sustained operational funding. We want this kind of to be normal and operational, right? We don't want the, I think one of my problems with many of the investments in tracking and advocating to research software is that over time, many of them have been sort of point-in-time investments that look great, and you're like, wow, I want this. And then 2 years later, it sort of is on ice and it's a frozen version of the thing because the money ran out. So I do think sustainability and sort of long-lived operations of these kinds of tools is a really important thing to consider.
That's a really good point, Arvon. And of course, we from our perspective, I can just comment that we've tried to build the. This was one of the motivation why we tried to build the SoFAIR workflow around existing infrastructures, basically, which would kind of take ownership, basically, of them. And of course, the solution is not linked to specific infrastructures. It's a modular thing which can be moved around and can be quite flexible. I wanted to ask Kathleen, actually. So Kathleen, ensuring sort of longevity of the outputs from project is always a challenge. Hence, for the SoFAIR project, all the models and code and workflow are publicly available. But the project also takes advantage of a well-recognized existing protocol, the Core Notify, to ensure that compatibility with repository, to ensure this compatibility with repository software. And with that in mind, what would be the best paths to take to ensure widespread adoption of these tools? And I know that you are doing a lot as part of COAR for the adoption of Core Notify.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're in a place now where we've invested in the adoption or development of Core Notify. So in almost all the open source repository platforms. So by next year, I think the recent versions of all the open source repository platforms will be Core Notify enabled, so to speak. So I think the functionality is going to be available to a large portion of the repository community very soon. You know, of course, institutions are not always on the latest versions and so on. And then, so that solves one problem, but then the second problem is like using that functionality for the purpose of linking between all of these various related research outputs. And I think that's going to take, a longer time for that to become something that is, shall we say, common practice when you're depositing a manuscript, and then you can link to the data set that happens to be in another repository elsewhere, and the software is in Software Heritage or GitHub or whatever. So, I do think the Core Notify protocol will facilitate these links across the ecosystem, but there's still going to be take time, to get the community socialized around these ideas and adopting those kind of practices.
So maybe just let me add to that, Kathleen, that we've been very lucky that Core Notify became available around the time when we were actually working on the SoFAIR project, because that enabled us to conduct the orchestration between these systems in an interoperable fashion. So we're very grateful, basically, to the work of the Core Notify team for that. And so this is something that played definitely into our cards. I have a last question kind of for John. John, how do you see, with, for instance, Core Notify available now, and with SoFAIR, this kind of demonstrates the ability that repositories can these days, and repositories and other open scholarly infrastructures can talk to each other in a machine-readable fashion. As a repository manager, how do you see these interactions being sort of more adopted and made available and made and built on by repository managers in the future? Do you think that this is to what extent do you think that the world is going to change, basically, and these will be kind of important assets for the repositories network?
So I think there'll be a period that sort of UK repositories definitely a kind of slightly hamstrung or under resourced currently from a technical layer, and also from the processing resource. So there's much of this that can be automated. So when you mentioned previously the integration between Core and Software Heritage, and that giving a confidence sort of value that lowers the human endeavor that's needed to start shifting this data between systems. So And as Kathleen sort of just said, having a repository that's core notify enabled doesn't mean it's being used, or that people have put the thinking caps on and worked out actually this is how we're going to use it. These are the use cases. So getting something like this sort of on the radar now, so when people are implementing sort of core notify and turning it on for the first time, it's something that we can just do and it's there, I think is really nice and will help. And I think there's also something around sort of the flow of data out of the repositories. So something like the open air metadata profile coming out of OAI PMH and making sure that the persistent identifiers identified in those, and make sure your data is mapped through to that properly, which again is a piece of technical work for the likes of myself to do, but joining all these things up so you've got stuff coming in and going out at the same time, with the assertions that this is something that the core / SWH have asserted we think is the right piece of software, or this is something that the author has definitely said is the right thing. And this is for repository land, this is our own bread and butter. So this should be us eating our own dog food. This should make us all very happy, because it's where we want to be. And if we make it work for software, we start making it work for all sorts of other output types that are in other domains. So in the non-technical, non-software domains, I think this will help those in the future.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much, Kathleen, Arfon. I think this is a great point at which we can, it's very positive and forward-looking. So maybe we can stop the panel here. I would like to thank you very, very much for coming here. I am aware that Kathleen needs to kind of go. So, really big thank you to Arfon, Kathleen, and John. What we can do here for the purposes, from the perspective of the SoFAIR project, if there are still any questions, we can maybe dedicate a few more minutes to answer some of those questions, because I haven't been able to really pay attention to the chat that much. So, with that, David, I think maybe you can also come in with me here on the stage. And I honestly, you probably had a little bit more time to scan through the chat. Have you seen anything that we should really answer at this point?
Yeah, we've got a couple of interesting points coming in the chat as well that I'd like to. This is for everybody, including the panel members that are still with us. Let me scroll through and we'll come through to a couple of points.
We can't see you, by the way, David. Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
We can hear you. We can't see you.
Sorry. I can solve that straight away. In fact, there's an interesting question from Thomas here, who says, there's a potential here. We've discussed it from the repository end, but we haven't discussed it from the publication end. And Tomasz, I'm going to paraphrase your question slightly, because Tomasz mentions journals in particular, but I think conferences as well. Is how and should journal and conference policies include the requirement for authors to cite software that's being used in their papers, and to include SWIDs and repository control links?
Will you answer this question, David?
I say it's an interesting one for me, because we've taken this from the repository, and it's not one thing. And I say I'd like to open this to the panel, because I'm not sure I'm in a position to answer this. But
we closed the panel now. Okay, so we can't. Yeah. Okay. Do we have other questions which are more, specifically to SoFAIR? And if there's anybody who would like to speak at this point, that's also fine. We can try to answer a question if there's anybody who would like to ask a question. John.
I'll just try and sort of on Thomas's sort of question and the how do we fix the journal policies or that side of things. I think this goes sort of round to a very general kind of thing, where if anything has a PID, it should be cited with that PID. And so getting software to have persistent identifiers, much the same as the adoption of ORCIDs or anything else sort of persistent. I think starting to build those things into the workflows. And I was sort of thinking, does JATS have a way of kind of doing the software mentions with? Obviously, it supports PIDs, it supports different elements, but it's almost like this piece of work will help us push the they don't necessarily need to start thinking about software. I mean, they do, but we can start putting the PIDs into the articles. And if you're writing something that's got a reference to a piece of software in, use it, cite it properly with a PID, and then eventually they'll suddenly start going, well, actually, yeah, there is quite a lot of these. We do need to support them properly, and then they'll hopefully start flowing out the other end, much like I think will happen with the repositories.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, John. I think that's great. I am also seeing a question here, which is, apart from the software version, is it also important to document how it was installed? I am thinking of projects like Isabel, blah, blah, blah. I think this is, indeed, I think this is, it's not just that research software was used, right? Like you would like to ideally know the environment in which it was used, what was the configuration, how it was used exactly. So, having some sort of configuration files and so on would be incredibly valuable. I think that this is unfortunately beyond the scope of this project, but it's definitely, the direction that we support. I don't know if anybody else from the SoFAIR project would like to comment on this. If so, then feel free to chip in, basically. Just raise your hand and you can answer the question. And then there is a question from Paulina. Was this a UK and an EU-based project? Seems to be UK organization dominated. So it was an EU-funded project in the CHIST-ERA call, which basically means that it is funded. It's a fairly awkward scheme where the national funders funded, but it is so the funding comes from national agencies, but it's an international EU-based project basically. And so CHIST-ERA has also some funding from the European Commission. So that's where it comes from. There were two UK organizations. That was the Open University and Europe PMC. So EMBL EBI, effectively, with their Europe PMC infrastructure. But there were partners from France, that is INRIA, contributing 3 infrastructures. And then we had a Polish partner and a Czech partner. David, do you see any other questions which we should really answer at this point?
There's a couple of later ones. I'm not sure whether I'm going to throw this one to you, Pet, or anybody else from the SoFAIR team. This was also Paulina. Someone's also had a request to say if we finish presenting, could we stop sharing the screen now because they can't see our faces?
Okay.
They'd like to see our faces, which is an interesting and lovely point. How well do you think the system would cope with the flood of vibe-coded apps, personalized software and interfaces created by LLMs? Now, there's an interesting one here. You say anyway, Petter, did you want to come on that one?
What we are doing in the SoFAIR project is we're processing manuscripts, effectively. So we're processing manuscripts which might contain references to research software. So if we are not really impacted by the way the research software was created. So if the research software is in a particular research software repository, could be GitHub, could be many other repositories, then we're really not impacted by the mechanism through which that research software has been created. We also don't judge whether this is good research software or bad research software. So we're kind of agnostic as a project to this point. Now, I don't want to comment basically on whether vibe coding is a good thing or a bad thing. Basically, I would leave this to others to judge, basically.
There's an interesting point directly related to this from Francois, who's just said the fact that we are as academics, we're well versed in reviewing academic papers and how to review academic papers. It said efforts should also be provided on the evaluation side to support journals and reviewers to properly assess software and a nice term, non-traditional research outputs such as data papers and workflow papers. And there's mentioned something here called the Atrium Project, which is working on a peer review project. It's an interesting thing about helping people to understand the quality of a non-traditional research output, whether that's a data set, whether that's a piece of software.
And if I may, I would really love to, I find this a fascinating question, and I would really like to answer, because it has actually, I have been for a very long time concerned by the fact that the peer review process is actually only considering the manuscript itself. And if you're only considering the manuscript, you're not looking into the data, you're not looking into the software, you cannot, as a peer reviewer, peer reviewers are not checking the reproducibility of those studies. There's no scope for that. And so then it comes to the question of what is the role of the peer review if it cannot kind of guarantee reproducibility? It still has a role, I think, which is important for giving feedback to people, understanding whether methodologically the study seems sound and so forth. But we need to understand that the fact that a particular paper has a stamp of being peer reviewed doesn't necessarily mean that we can trust it. Unfortunately, that's the case. There will be many peer-reviewed papers which are generally wrong. I wonder if there are other people. I don't know, John, Arfon, if you would like to chip in here, feel free to do so, or anybody else from the SoFAIR project. If you want to mention anything here, feel free to speak up.
I think John is still with us. Arfon has just exited stage left
Okay.
gracefully.
Yes.
He's had to move off to another meeting, as has
Of course.
Kathleen now.
Of course, yes. So I think unless there are any more questions which we should answer, David, I don't know, do you see anything else which requires attention?
We've just had one final pop up, and I'm happy to take this question and talk about it again offline, because it's an incredibly, it's a really, really significant question, and there's two things to say. When the authors say we provide code and data at, and then provide a link, but they don't specifically name a software, and research software names is something we've spent an awful lot of time looking at within the SoFAIR project. And one of the ones we keep talking about is Octopus. If you look at Octopus in GitHub, you will find many repositories that are called Octopus, and identifying the particular one that you are talking about is very challenging for the model. And it's another reason why the author validation step in the middle is critical, and can be critical to this part of the process. But yes, we do wish researchers would always name the software and provide links to GitHub. As I commented to Thomas in the questions earlier, even having the link to the repository is somewhat rarer than one would imagine.
Yes, and of course, there are many other considerations here. For instance, the fact that we know what the software was is still not necessarily enough. We would ideally like to know which particular version of that software was used to conduct that specific study. But we need to start somewhere. The fact that we don't have a link is a huge hurdle. If we have a link, once we have a link, we can start talking about, do we have the right version? Do we really understand? Do we understand the environment in which it was used, and so forth? So these things are all very important, but we believe that without having the link to the software, it's kind of everything is almost pointless. So yeah, that's I think where we are. I wanted to mention one more thing which we didn't have time to really address in the presentation. A lot of the mentions of software are actually kind of implicit. So not always software is not always identified by a name, unfortunately. So very often it's just the source code, or the researchers had to conduct some analysis, and the analysis is in GitHub, but there's no named software basically, which is making the extraction even more complicated. Okay, with that, David, do you see any more questions?
I'd just like to thank everybody for coming along, and everybody from the SoFAIR project, those of you who are here, and our panelists as well. We're sort of up on time as we get to there, and thank you for all of your questions. We've had lots of nice feedback. I believe the recording of this will be made available as well for those that weren't able to attend as well, and that will be published via the SoFAIR website. There is a link in the chat to that as well.
So I thank you everybody for your attention, for spending your time with us. We hope this was inspiring and you managed to learn something here. And we hopefully opened more problems than we managed to solve. But I think that's part of our job. So thank you very much again, and have a lovely rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.